Hello, everyone. I am Tristan Lee, an engineer at Edgio on the community support team, and today I would like to make a quick technical video about how you can get your site set up on Edgio applications. So the goal in this video is I want to take an existing site that I may have hosted elsewhere or that is already on an existing CDN somewhere that we want to move over to Edgio to see the benefits of the performance and security aspect. So my example site here is just a WordPress blog that is very basic. Literally just has one page here and a menu of the home page. So not a whole lot to it. Um, but the important thing to note here is that this isn't, specific to WordPress. It's works for any site, whether you have an e-commerce application, you've got something, a serverless framework such as Next or Nuxt. Um, so this works for all sites. So the goal here is, again, we want to take this site and host it on Edgio. So what I'm going to do is start by clicking up here at Try Edgio. This will take us over to the developer console where you can either create a new account if this is your first time visiting. I'm actually going to use my personal GitHub account here. And so when you first sign up, you are presented with this getting started screen. And what we want to do here is enter in our existing website URL. So I'm gonna come over here, copy this, and paste this in. So what we are presented with here is a quick start command that we could just copy and paste into our terminal to initialize our application. But before we do that, let me just kind of explain what's going on here. So what we're doing is we're using Node to uh, actually call our Edgio CLI. And what we want to do is we're going to call the init command. What the init command does is it basically creates locally on your machine a new Edgio application that we're going to name based on our example URL called edgioexample.blog. And then we are going to create a new environment called production. So whenever we actually create a new site on Edgio, by default, you get a default environment that everything initially deploys to. Uh, but when you are actually moving over a production site and you're ready to actually launch your site on Edgio live, we're likely going to want to have a different environment specific to going to production. So what this does, it automatically creates a second environment in addition to default called production. The origin is actually going to be the host or IP address of the existing website that we want to put Edgio in front of. And lastly, the deploy flag is saying, okay, once we initialize our application and build it locally, automatically deploy it for me. This is going to get your site bundled and deployed to Edgio, and then we will see that here shortly up on this screen. Okay, so we'll copy this and paste this in our terminal. Actually, let me switch over to a test directory and paste this command. So what this is going to do is actually download and execute the Edgio CLI and run the init command. Okay, so now we're prompted. Let's see, should we create a new directory? Yes, so we want to create a new directory for our Edgio application, and it gives you the option to choose between npm or yarn. I'm going to continue with the default as npm. And now what we've done is the CLI has created a local node project. And now it's just installing, adding the Edgio core CLI prefetch and DevTools modules to to the new project that was just created. So let's wait for these to finish installing. Okay, so now everything's been installed. It did create two new files for us, which I will get into shortly. But first, the CLI is going to need to authenticate you in order to be able to deploy to the console. So go ahead and click continue. It should open up a new browser window. And yes, let us create an access token. Okay, let's close this. Okay, so this is the previous page at where had we had just, went through the getting started guide. And so now we can see a deployment's in progress. So let's head back to the CLI. We can see that we are now logged in. We are deploying to our private space. So by default, when you deploy a site, it's going to go to your personal space. It's under this name, edgioexample.blog, to the production environment, and we are using the current latest version, which is Edgio version 506, and our first deployment. So then what this did, it went through and actually bundled our Edgio application and bundled it, uploaded it, and deployed it. Now we're presented with a deployment complete screen. Uh, the Edgio developer console. So this is the screen behind us where we were. This is a direct link to this specific build. Then we have a permalink. This is a publicly accessible link that is specific to this build. So you can see build one here. So in the future, each time you make a new deployment, you'll get a new permalink. So let's say 5 deployments from now, you want to see what happened on this build. You come directly back to this link and you can see how the site was at this state. And lastly, we have the Edge URL. So this is going to be the production URL that is going to have the latest deployment serving from the Edgio Edge. And let's see, last thing here, changed into the directory. So we need to move into the new directory that was just created, edgioexample.blog. And let's go ahead and open this up in VS Code. Just real quick here, to run the app locally, we can run Edgio dev or EDG for short. And then we can redeploy it using Edgio deploy. But let's open up this in VS Code and take a look kind of how everything is put together before we continue on. So the first thing, let's take a look at package.json. This is just a very basic package here with only the Edgio dev dependencies. And if you recall on the CLI initially, we had some new files that are created. So let's go over those. First one being the Edgio config.js. So this is the configuration file that kind of tells Edgio how to work. So first thing is the backends. This is what we define as a backend that Edgio will use to proxy to. So we have the domain or IP set up as edgioexample.blog, which is the domain that we initially gave it during the setup process. And we also set the host header as the same. Another important one here, especially if you're working on like a new site that isn't entirely set up yet, and so it might not be, uh, properly set up with certificates. You may get some certificate errors and requests will fail if that's the case. You can come in here and kind of for development or debugging purposes, uncomment this to disable cert checking. However, I do not recommend doing that in a production environment. You want to make sure the certificates are valid. Let's see, another important one here, a name. So this is just the name of this site as it appears in the developer console. There's a few more other things down here. Routes. So we'll touch on this next. What this does basically tells you where to look for the Edgio router. So since this is just a very plain Edgio app, there's not a whole lot of other files here. Now, if you have something like a Next.js or Nux project, you're going to have a lot more configuration files in here, including all your source pages and things like that. So you might want to move some of the Edgio logic into its own folder. So just as an example, I will create a new folder here, and I'm just going to call it Edgio, and let's move our routes to that. And so here I can just come in and type in Edgio, just give it a relative path to the project root and save that. And there's more options down here. You can find out more about those on our technical documentation site. So the next thing here is the routes file that I just mentioned. So the way the router is working right now, by default, out of the box, you get this Edgio router. Um, and what it does is we have a fallback handler set up. The fallback handler is going to accept any route or any request that does not match any handlers that have been previously defined. So since there are no other handlers defined at the moment, the fallback is going to accept any request that comes in, and we're telling it to proxy to the origin. So the origin is again back here in the Edgio configuration file. We define this under backends, and the when you first set up this application, it's going to just create one by default called origin with the domain that we had already specified. You can create more than one backend. So if you have, say, an API backend, for example, you just come in here and create a similar configuration, api.edgioexample.blog, and you can just make the host header the same. Now, this is just an example of how you can add an additional backend. I actually don't have an API. This, domain does not exist on the WordPress site, so it wouldn't be valid. But this is an example of how you would add an additional backend. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this for now, since it's actually not going to be used. So let's take a look at. Actually, first, let's go back here to the developer console and let's take a look. So our site's deployed, and let's look at it on our the Edge link here. So as you can see, we are accessing the site that is deployed to Edgio, and what it is doing, it is proxying the request to my WordPress site, actually hosted on WordPress.com. So it is proxying to the origin backend that I defined as my edgioexample.blog and returning that content back through Edgio servers and sending it to me. So what I would like to do here is there's really nothing special going on with the router. Again, it's just proxying directly. So if we're on an existing CDN, or if our provider already has some, uh, you know, cache headers being sent, we're just going to get whatever the default cache behavior is right there. But let's say we want to add some additional caching or customize our caching. We can come in here and comment out this example with the match. I am going to update the route that I'm going to match and remove API. And what this is going to do is just a wildcard that basically says we want to match every single request that comes in, and we will give it this variable called path. So essentially, we are matching any get, post, any type of request that comes in is getting matched here. So essentially, this is overriding what we would have back here as the fallback. So we don't even need that anymore. And so the next thing we're going to do is in our request handler, we're going to destructure the proxy and cache component. So we already used the proxy component down here in the fallback, so it's going to be used here again. But the new thing that we're going to be adding is some cache logic. So what this is going to say is, okay, at the edge, I want to cache the response for a maximum of 1 day. And in the browser, I'm setting the maximum age seconds to 0, which is essentially disabling the browser cache. The reason you might want to do this, and you probably wouldn't want to do it on this example for, matching every single request that comes in, but for things that aren't going to change a whole lot, like static assets, so images, fonts, JavaScript files, like anything like that that's likely not going to change between deployments. Those things you would be fine to cache those in the browser. But for things that like the WordPress blog, it could change tomorrow. So I don't want to cache it in the browser for an extended duration and have potentially outdated content. So in this example, we're just going to set the edge caching to 1 day. So up top here, I have a few other variables is also included. So let's go ahead and uncomment those. And before deploying this, let's test this out locally just to make sure this actually works. So what I can do is run Edgio dev, because when we initialize the application, it installed a global version of the Edgio CLI, so we can just run Edgio command anywhere now. So we'll start Edgio dev, and this is just going to start a local dev server here at localhost port 3000. And as you can see, our request came through, proxied from our origin, and everything is working as expected. So we have a change here. Obviously, the change is we're now adding caching. So the next thing I would like to do is actually deploy this, and we can simply just run Edgio deploy. It knows where to deploy it to based on the name that we have set up here. And because we already had one deployment, this actually next deployment should go quite a bit quicker. The first deployment usually takes a little bit longer just because it has a provision, like a brand new environment. So this one should be quite a bit quicker. We see, let's see, deployment was complete. So let's go back to the browser, back to our developer console, click on overview. Actually, let's click on deployments. Okay, so here we go. Here's our second deployment. And okay, this was actually deployed to the default environment. And the reason that was is if you recall, when I first initialized the application, we had the flag that said environment production. That's what was given to us, from the quick start command. So here, when I ran Edgio deploy, I didn't actually specify the environment I wanted to deploy it to, so it just deployed to the default environment, which is okay. I actually made a change that I would want to test, actually, in staging before actually pushing to production. So that's a good example of why we deploy to default. So let's take a look here. Let's see, we got the preview here. It's obviously, everything obviously worked because we have a preview. So what I would like to do is just to kind of verify that my changes that I made to the router are going to be there. Let's go back here to the terminal, and I want to use the Edgio CLI again, and use the curl command. So we actually have some functionality built in that runs the underlying curl command, but with additional metrics and telemetry information that might be helpful in debugging or just looking at the performance of your site. So I'm going to run Edgio curl and then just give it the URL that we're going to fetch, and let's maximize, make it a little easier to read. Okay, so actually some of these highlighted ones here are ones that are specific to Edgio. I would like to point out this one, X0 caching status okay. And if we look at the cache control header, we have a max age of 86,400 seconds. So that is going to be the 1 day, cache time that we had set. Look at some of the telemetry data here. We could see under the caching status, it says cached. So because this was very likely the very first request that was made to this URL since deployment, it was likely a cache miss at the edge because there was no cache already there, no request has been made. So it shows that it was cached. So let's run the same request again, and we should get a cache hit. Yes, so we can see here that cache status also okay. We have a hit as defined down here in the caching status. And yeah, so just another little kind of helpful tip on how you can, look at some of the response information that comes back from the Edgio Edge. So that kind of wraps up all I wanted to showcase today on getting started. For more information, definitely head on over to our developer documentation here. The Getting Started guide, this will give you, a little bit more about like, obviously the prerequisites and what you need um, locally on your machine and, just understanding the environments that will be deployed to. So, um, again, this kind of goes through what we already been through. We have the Edgio CLI already installed locally. Again, npm or yarn. We've already created a new account. So just to continue on that, I mean, we can go in here into the basics. Again, some things we've already touched on, creating the environments, and actually setting up your domain. So the next step here, before you go 100% live, once you're ready to, set my Edgio example.blog site, I want to actually host that on Edgio and change the DNS over to Edgio. Come back here to the actual site in the developer console, and we have steps on what you need to do with your DNS provider. You actually get it transitioned over to Edgio. So this is going to vary, based on who your host is. So mine's through WordPress, so I would have to go through their control panel and set up everything that way. And this also helps you get your certificate set up. So you can find out more about this if you get hung up along the way, how you can set this up from our technical documentation. Head on over to docs.edg.io. If you have any questions, head on over to our forums, forum.edg.io, and just use this and feel free to ask any questions, and I will be happy to answer and help you along the way.